By far the oldest attested archaeological sites, and thus sites displaying the first traces of civilization, are found in the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East, and the gap is not even close. The Middle East precedes other agricultural nuclei by thousands of years, with many other civilizations deriving their ignition into existence from Middle Eastern societies via trade and interaction. This presents two rather pressing dilemmas. The first pertains to the timing of agriculture globally. You see, while there is a clear geographic winner in terms of where agriculture first arose, the civilizational nuclei are well within an order of magnitude of each other when you consider the history of humanity as a whole. More precisely, agriculture abruptly began in the last 5% of human history, a comparatively very short window for multiple agricultural societies to independently arise in. The word independently is important here and can be confirmed by tracing prehistoric global trade, as said trade would indicate the exchange of ideas between people who could describe various components of civilization to each other. While we do have evidence of said trade in ancient times, we do not have evidence of the dead giveaway of agriculture reaching places like China from the Middle East. Wheat, with China itself not gaining wheat until several thousand years after its agricultural revolution. Other societies are even more evidently detached. Take, for example, the Mesoamericans. We have zero reason to suspect any trade occurred between the Middle East and Mesoamerica at any time in pre-Columbian history, let alone 5,000 years ago. There is marginal evidence of interaction between Siberian and Polar American hunter-gatherer tribes within this time frame, but it would be exceptionally unlikely for agriculture to somehow bridge the gap between the Middle East and Mesoamerica through the vector of northern hunter-gatherer tribes, since those tribes don't practice agriculture themselves. And again, we lack any evidence like traded plants, seeds, or tools. The second pressing question is, why did agriculture, and thus civilization, arise in the Middle East first out of all places, particularly when the vast majority of the region is harsh and arid desert, with the actual area that agriculture began in, the so-called Fertile Crescent, being not that fertile in the first place, having quickly depleted soils and often requiring tedious irrigation canals to plant crops, whereas other areas such as sub-Saharan Africa or northern India seem far more apt for agriculture's early development. Moreover, the first farmers and the first towns they inhabited weren't in the more hospitable river valleys of the Fertile Crescent. They were in the upland, hilly regions of the Levant, where irrigation was far harder and the mountain terrain more difficult to farm in. This topic also holds massive importance to ideas of cultural or civilizational superiority. If the Middle East is such a mediocre place for agriculture, why did agriculture start there? Are its inhabitants uniquely hardworking or innovative? What, then, does that mean for its stagnation in modern times, or for the meteoric rise of Western civilization? Moreover, the oldest traceable language family in the world is Afro-Asiatic, the family dominant in and around the Middle East and containing languages such as Arabic, the Berber/Amazigh dialects, or even ancient Egyptian. I specifically say oldest traceable because linguistic traceability largely comes down to how much written content we have in the language. And due to how uniquely old the Middle East civilizations are, we have written content going back very far. In fact, the first manuscripts from Egypt date back to roughly the time frame we can trace the origin of the Indo-European languages back to, the languages spanning half the world and some of its most powerful societies. These questions about the Middle East's preeminence thus pose immense importance to nationalists both in and out of the Middle East, and cultural supremacists outside of the Middle East have especially had difficulty grasping the dissonance between the early emergence of civilization here and the superiority of their civilization, which emerged later and not here. And while I'm not coming out in support of Burkina Faso supremacy or anything of the like, it seems quite likely that the earliness of the Middle East in adopting agriculture and civilization largely comes down to environmental factors, not cultural ones or anything exemplary about its people. Famous anthropologist Jared Diamond attempted to address this in his infamous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. While his book is often more renowned for his explanation of why Western society thrived where others didn't, I would argue his points on why civilization began in the Middle East are even more profound. He brought down the issue to one largely of an abundance of domesticatable organisms in the Middle East, specifically an abundance of domesticatable seed plants and animals. For animals, Diamond argues that only a minority of species are actually domesticatable, since a lot of traits have to be present in them, like a proper speed of maturation and reproduction, a natural hierarchy in their social structure, and easily sustained diets. There are many species held in captivity today not containing these criterion, like with the ostrich regularly being farmed in countries like Egypt, and in fact, many Christian monasteries in Egypt farm ostriches as a chief source of income. But we cannot expect a hunter-gatherer society to have the same technology, resource availability, or even just desire to collect animals for enlightenment purposes, as do the people of the 21st century. I would add something to the criterion: size. Without large domesticatable animals, megafauna, it's really hard to attain caloric surpluses from meat, as smaller domestics like rabbits really only provide a meal or two worth of food, and since they reproduce so abundantly in the wild, it's not really worth the effort of trying to domesticate them unless you have other animals that provide the bulk of your meat supply. The biggest benefit, then, for a society is for there to be as many megafauna present as possible, so that the chances of a few of them being worth the effort of domestication increases. The Middle East is gifted in this regard, being the birthplace of the domestic cow, pig, sheep, and goat, among others, with those four species alone representing the majority of human meat consumption for most of human history. But why, specifically, did the Middle East have so many large species worth domesticating? Diamond argues that the answer largely boils down to how long animal species have been in contact with humans and their evolutionary siblings, like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo denisova, etc. This duration of contact is longest in Eurasia and Africa, where we have concrete evidence of both modern humans and older species like Neanderthals going back hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Essentially, human tool innovation has been breathtakingly slow for the vast majority of human history, and the further back you go, the more primitive tools get, naturally. So the species that have had the longest time to co-evolve alongside of us have had the best luck in staving off overhunting from us and our technologies, be it by evolving to be more fleety, aggressive, or elusive. Animals who aren't used to humans, on the other hand, have no evolutionary programming to fear us, and so become really easy targets for overhunting. This likely explains why the Americas had so few domesticated animals prior to European contact. The native animal species of the New World had not encountered humans at all before roughly 15,000 years ago when the first ones came. And so these animals were docile and oblivious, and thus quite easy for early indigenous peoples to hunt to extinction. This surplus of nutritious meat caused the native populations to explode while it lasted, as the original founding population of the Americas was only a few hundred, but had ballooned to multiple millions within a few thousand years. We even see evidence for this in the large animals that did survive the peopling of the Americas. In his book Ecological Imperialism, Alfred Crosby mentions that big game like bison or elk that survived here pretty much all have very close relatives in the Old World, like the elk being distributed on both sides of the Bering Land Bridge, or the American bison having its European bison counterpart. These species either had recent migrations that pushed human-fearing genes into their New World populations, or were lucky enough to be from a species that had naturally human-opposing traits. This last part, human-opposing traits, may be the reason that the cassowaries of Papua New Guinea both survived and remained undomesticated. Large cassowaries weigh about as much as the average sheep, and so they definitely hold enough meat to be worth domesticating. And it's not that the natives of Papua New Guinea didn't try either, as we have evidence of them attempting to tame cassowaries by stealing their eggs and attempting to raise them in captivity from over 18,000 years ago. However, the bird is just a complete nightmare to deal with, being extremely aggressive, fast, and carrying literal knives on its feet, 5-inch talons that can rip through human abdomens. Thus, it's entirely possible some creatures just got lucky by being one of God's monstrosities. However, humans have been present in New Guinea for over 60,000 years, over 3 times as long as they have been present in the Americas. So it's possible that even there, the animals like the cassowary co-evolved alongside humanity from an early enough time for them to survive. New Guinea was actually a really promising contender for cultivating one of the earliest civilizations, featuring some of the most densely populated regions in the world in the pre-modern era, as its highlands have incredibly fertile volcanic soil and year-round temperate, warm, and predictable weather. The lack of livestock really hindered it and left its inhabitants often protein deficient. This protein deficiency is thought to be why cannibalism was so common in New Guinea, and why cannibalism maintains its last global vestiges in some of New Guinea's most remote tribes. It's important to note that the opposite situation, animals having too much time to co-evolve alongside of us, makes the situation equally difficult. This is what is thought to have happened in sub-Saharan Africa. Humanity emerged from Africa's grasslands, so the animals there have had by far the longest time to get to know us, and specifically get to know how to defend against our attacks. Even in the modern day, Africa maintains by far the highest concentration and diversity of megafauna in the world, and the fauna's head start in resisting prehistoric human hunters is likely the biggest reason why. But so without many domesticatable fauna, Sub-Saharan African, Native American, and New Guinean societies were left at a massive disadvantage, whereas the Middle East's surplus of such species propelled it forward, giving it an early caloric surplus for society to be built with. But that is only one half of Diamond's argument, and in fact only one half of the domestication story. Plants remain a big mystery. Luckily for the Middle East, however, its ecology excels in this category as well. For this, we return to the initial question of how could the Middle East centers of agriculture, the not-so-humid hilly areas of the Levant and southern Anatolia, be the place where society began if they are so unimportant for later agriculture as in the modern day, as compared to river valleys and wetter regions of the globe, which hold immense agricultural importance now and have held such importance for thousands of years. This question is somewhat faulty, however, as while those areas are not the best for agriculture per se, they are the best for producing species of plants that are most useful to domesticate and plant intensively. You see, the areas of the Middle East where agriculture began experience a special climate, the hot summer type Mediterranean climate. Like its name implies, this climate range is known for its hot, very dry summers and relatively cool winters ranging from moderately wet to near monsoon conditions. Fall and spring in this climate range tend to either be a gradual gradient between summer and winter or experience a sudden shift, usually in October and May. Antakya, Turkey is a good exemplar of this climate type, with its summers being quite dry and its winters experiencing near monsoon level rains. This climate, especially since these areas tend to experience very little frost in the winter, produces immense blooms in the spring to take advantage of the warm and wet conditions, blooms that dry out by the end of the summer as their roots cannot grow fast enough to extend deep into the soil to reach water trapped there, whereas the surface soil dries out in the Mediterranean sun. This cyclic climate thus favors annual plants that produce dry seeds by the fall, which happen to be perfect for humans to collect, store, and turn into crops. Wheat and pulses, which are essentially things like beans, prospered in this climate and produced multiple varieties here that humans ended up exploiting. The Middle East was further blessed in the higher nutritional value of its staple crops as compared to other regions, as the ancient wheat varieties of the Middle East, for example, contain almost double the protein amount per gram as compared to the ancient rice varieties of China. Also, this higher nutritional value might have been due to there being more annual plant species here in the first place. So the first farmers might have implicitly selected the most nutritional varieties, and then those communities fared better and took over the Middle East, whereas the communities that selected the less nutritious crops did not fare as well and were outcompeted. The ones with the more nutritious crops fared quite well, in fact, and with their millennia-long head start to the civilization game, these areas quickly became some of the most densely populated in the world. Finally, the relatively small plot of arable land in the Middle East may have actually been beneficial for encouraging agriculture to start there, because it forced hunter-gatherers to become farmers, which is something they seem to not really want to do. For this last point, it is hard for us to see such a concept considering we are so far removed from our prehistoric past, but hunter-gatherers had much higher quality of lives than their agrarian counterparts, with hunter-gatherers having much better diets, healthier bodies, tighter-knit tribes, and even working fewer hours per week. Agriculture was not great for its followers, but it entrapped them in its existence because farming produces large excess food stores that resulted in more food available year-round for more mouths to feed. But those mouths would starve if they went back to hunter-gatherer times because agriculture supports a much higher population density than hunting and gathering can. Simply put, agriculture allows us to near totally exploit the environment around us, whereas hunting and gathering forces us to be another niche in ecology and thus does not allow us to take full advantage of the environment's energy potential. In fact, in the book The Future Eaters, author Tim Flannery mentions that hunter-gatherers usually only utilize 20 to 30% of the resources that they can, mainly because they have no defense against a resource-poor season since they don't have large food stores. The resource-poor seasons would reduce their populations if they exceeded this 20 to 30% threshold, since if your population is using 100% of the resources of a good season and you encounter a bad season that only produces 30% of a good season's resources, your population would shrink back down to 30% of the good season's resource amounts. And it would take much longer to recover than shrink since humans take so long to reproduce and mature. But yeah, this resource exploitative existence effectively trapped communities in agriculture once they established themselves within it. I've heard the comparison multiple times now between this trap into agriculture and the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. While I do think some of the claims of how great life supposedly was for humans when we were hunter-gatherers are a little exaggerated, it would make a lot of sense if the forbidden fruit was actually a metaphor for the fruit of our labor, agriculture. It's not hard to see how prehistoric tales about the hardships of farming could slowly transform over the generations into biblical tales about the fall of mankind. As for why this trap happened in the Middle East before other places, it seems that again we can look to the unique climactic setup of the Middle East. For some background, in all places where agriculture first arose, it is likely that the agrarians and the hunter-gatherers were in constant competition, with the hunter-gatherers raiding the agrarian settlements where they could. In areas that were still low in population density, this would have made it really difficult for agriculture to be sustainable, as the less healthy agrarians would have had to stave off attacks from the well-fed, evasive hunter-gatherers, and did not yet have the population momentum to vastly outnumber the hunter-gatherers. It is likely then that the first farming communities took a while to establish themselves, slowly growing against the resistance from hunter-gatherers. The Middle East seems to expedite this slow growth through two phenomena. Firstly, its Paleolithic inhabitants got an incredible boost from post-Ice Age climate change. Right after the last Ice Age, the world experienced the Balling-Alarod interstadial period, which raised temperatures globally and made the climate in the Middle East more wet and humid. I mentioned that the seasonal dryness of the Mediterranean climate was a boost for the development of the Middle East's plants that would later become humanity's first crops, but once those crop plants became established, the wetter conditions likely led to these species flourishing and also expanded the area of the Levant that had such crops growing wild. This led to the first sedentary communities in the Middle East, and the entire world in fact, evidenced by the existence of the Natufians. The Natufians were able to maintain sedentary hunter-gatherer communities, which were unique in the hunter-gatherer history of humanity, as rarely were wild plants that nutritious that human populations could be that dense, especially since technology had not yet reached a point of advancement for all of those nutrients to be efficiently extracted. Thus, the first phenomenon is this. It seems that in the Middle East, humanity encountered abundant enough edible wild plants to settle down into sedentary communities before starting to farm. We really don't have much evidence for this happening elsewhere in the world, with most evidence pointing to sedentary life and agriculture happening simultaneously. I should be careful saying this though, as this topic is like the anthropology version of the chicken and the egg debate, with scholars still quite conflicted on whether sedentary life or agriculture occurred first generally. Regardless, in the Middle East's case, it seems like its early inhabitants got a lucky boost from how bountiful for humans the environment there was. As an aside, and like I previously mentioned, this edible plant abundance seemed to come at the right time in humanity's technological progress as well, since people had advanced enough tools to process the staple crops of the Middle East into readily accessible calories. In fact, we have evidence that this technology was advanced enough that the Natufians were already making bread and beer. Crazy when you realize these people were alive 15,000 years ago. But back to my main point. This increased climactic wetness actually likely boosted both nomadic and sedentary hunter-gatherer population densities, as yes, the wild cereal and pulse crops were more abundant, but so were the prey animals that dined on them. So while humanity was able to settle down here first, we were one, still all hunter-gatherers, and two, the sedentary hunter-gatherers still had to compete with the nomadic ones, paralleling agrarian hunter-gatherer competition later in history. Something else was needed to catalyze agriculture from this warming period. Serendipitously, this catalyst came rather quickly, with the globe shifting into the Younger Dryas period, where global temperatures lowered and the Middle East dried up once again. This event reduced the amount of land available for both nomadic and sedentary hunter-gatherers to exploit, with wild cereal crops being especially affected by the change. Yet, right before this period, human populations here were growing quickly, so now you have a bunch of people left with too few resources to survive only hunting and gathering. This forced the sedentary hunter-gatherers to begin cultivating the plants they once were able to forage, while forcing the remaining nomadic hunter-gatherers in the Middle East to either settle down or go extinct, both expediting agricultural development in the Middle East and removing its competition from hunter-gatherers. The inverse of this agricultural pressure may also help to explain why other areas that thrived later on stalled in developing agriculture, most notably Europe. Europe experienced a large increase of usable land after the last ice age as compared to the contraction of usable land we saw in the Middle East, which could have had the opposite effect and stalled Europe's agricultural developments by reducing the pressure on its hunter-gatherers. So with that, it seems we have finally addressed the dilemma of just why agriculture and civilization first arose in the Middle East specifically. Yay! As for the other question, why agriculture independently arose in roughly the same time frame across the world, Alfred Crosby once again makes a rather thought-provoking point in his book Ecological Imperialism. He mentioned that, with the peopling of the Americas, humanity had largely conquered the globe and stood at its edge, yearning for something more. It had hunted Earth's biggest game to where they were not as abundant nor diverse anymore, but it was still hungry. I am paraphrasing, but his wording was largely in this poetic sort of tone. But it contained a pretty analytical truth. Humanity was relatively interconnected before the peopling of the Americas, and trade occurred globally to where human cultures were generally on the same level of technological advancement. We advanced enough to hunt the big game and grow our global population, but we got to a point where the game were too few for that to keep sustaining our growth. No one wants to go hungry, and so humanity, for the most part armed with similarly advanced tools globally, relatively simultaneously crossed the technological leap that is agriculture.